evening, everybody. Welcome to the Geography and Adventure program at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. Tonight's event is an exciting talk by Jonathan Lawley in conversation with his editor, Dr. Stephen Games from Envelope Books. In this evening's talk, Jonathan Lawley will be asking what responsibility descendants of colonial administrators, such as his grandfather, should take for the damage inflicted on innocent people, such as the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, the Jarawa, perhaps the oldest tribe in human history. The Jarawa face extinction because of a road that runs through pristine forests in the Indian-administered Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal. Can restorative actions be put in place to restore historic wrongs, and will it be enough to save their way of life? These are the questions that will be addressed. I should say that during the course of this discussion, the vocabulary that will be used was the vocabulary that was in general acceptance in the days in which the diaries and historic notes were taken, and reflect the attitudes and vocabulary of the period. Thank you. Over to you then, Dr. Games and Mr. Jonathan Lawley.
Thank you very much, Penny, but I need to say very quickly that it is Dr. Jonathan Lawley as well, that we wouldn't want to demean him. I have the honour of being Jonathan's publisher. His book, wonderful book, A Road to Extinction, came out just over a year or so ago. And I was very glad to publish it because Jonathan talks about an issue, an anthropological, a human interest issue that has not been raised by other people. And Jonathan we will talk later about the need to air this issue more. But to get us started, can I ask you, Jonathan, just to explain where it is that we're talking about? And I'm going to put up an image here. Can you explain what the setting is for the topic that we're going to be addressing?
The setting there is the Bay of Bengal, east of India, and these islanders were amongst those who left Africa between 60,000 and perhaps 100,000 years ago and migrated across the world. And that is the route that they took before the Indian Ocean flooded. Otherwise, there were no boats, of course, in those days, and it was an empty world. And they found themselves in this area east of India before the ocean came in. When it came in, they moved to higher ground. They were then stuck because they were far too far for canoes to get to hundreds of miles from the coasts of Burma and India. And there they continued a life similar to the one that they had left in the seat of mankind in Botswana. And they were unchanged. It was only in about 700 years ago that the first visiting human beings arrived in the form of Marco Polo and some Oriental people, and they encountered the islanders who killed them on sight. The islanders had this instinct that anybody from the outside was a danger to a life that they valued more than anything, and that life was a life very similar, if not completely unchanged from the one that they had left in India. And so that's the background to these people until finally the British contemplated taking on the islands in 1789, I think it was, and then decided for health reasons that it was just not viable. They went away, but then after the Indian Mutiny, they took the islands on in 1858 to establish a penal colony to accommodate mutineers. So that's the background.
And
that happens to be, I see up on the screen, is the circular jail, which was it became an enormous prison. And in the background, I can see Ross Island. I do happen to have been to the Andamans with my daughter just about 3 years ago, and that was where the governor lived, and there was a number of British soldiers. It's only about a mile across. So that looks like a government house, a rather romanticized view of Ross Island. Although now it's very much forested, so I'm surprised that the forest doesn't show up on that. But that looks a bit like government house. Anyway, that's the
think, Jonathan, that was an illustration that appeared in the Illustrated London News in 1872. Just to backtrack for a moment, there's an important distinction. Let's go back to this slide here. There's an important distinction to be made, isn't there, between the two sets of islands. We're talking about an archipelago of islands that leads from Sumatra in the south in a kind of curl round to the middle of Burma. And the two sets of islands are the Nicobars and the Andamans to the north. Now, each of those sets of islands had what one might call Aboriginal people who got stranded on them when the land flooded. But there was a huge difference, wasn't there, between the populations of people who then made up the Nicobars and the population that made up the Andamans. Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, the two sets of islands are totally different ethnically. The Andamans, people by these people who came directly from Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. The Nicobars were and are populated by Asian people who looked Asian and had relationships with India and Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, etc. It just so happened that the two sets of islands, separated by about 160 miles of sea, happened to be lumped together for administrative purposes by the British government at the time. So that's the background. But they were not original islanders, not like the Andamanese who'd been there for hundreds of thousands of years.
So the Nicobars were settled by people who'd come from from Burma or Sumatra, and yes. They developed quite sort of conventional trading relations, didn't they, with the area?
Yes, they absolutely. They were influenced by people coming in and introducing the Christian religion, and I think Mohammedanism as well. They had cottage industries. They were known to be experts in making pottery for the region. People traded with them.
Right.
They were totally different. Whereas the Andamans, until the British arrived and took it over, they were absolutely on their own, and they had acquired quite a reputation among seafaring people around the world, and they were pretty much untouched. And there were shipwrecks, of course, there, and the islanders got to know how to work metal, and they found the metal to tip their arrows with from the wrecks. Otherwise, they being hunter-gatherers, they had not discovered any agriculture. I was just looking today at a quote from my grandfather in his book, and he talks about the islanders not. He says he looked forward to them being trained in agriculture, and then later on he admits that all the time that the British were there, it had been impossible to persuade the islanders to learn anything about agriculture. They were totally stuck in the Stone Age. They could not be changed. And to this day, they play absolutely no part in the economy of the Andaman Islands. They are an extraordinary people, unlike any other people in the world who have embraced some sort of change. They have had contact. The Andamanese have not had contact with the rest of the world. And it's the whole situation is crying out for somebody, anthropologists, to take an interest. I mean, I'm no anthropologist. I'm very interested in my PhD is something to do with the effect on cultures on each other. But these people, they did not learn. And in fact, any learning, any contact between them and the rest of the world spells not just danger, but the certainty of extinction. Bear in mind that the Andamanese, they were originally 12 tribes. Now there are just tiny remnants of tribes. They died in their thousands when my grandfather was there, and before that, the tribes that survived were the Jarawa, who had nothing to do with the outsiders and refused to have any truck with them. No trade in seashells or trepang or honey or anything like that. And those sort of contacts are what brought the diseases in. The malaria, there's not the malaria, the measles, the influenza, the syphilis brought that in. The other tribe that was not affected was the North Sentinelese, the people who killed just 3 years ago the American would-be missionary John Chow. These islanders are really extraordinary people, and their continued existence depends on their being left alone by the rest of the world.
Jonathan, let's just talk a little bit about what sort of people they are. We talk about them as Stone Age, almost relics of the Stone Age, Paleolithic survivors. What sort of life are they living, and that makes them so distinct from the new arrivals on the Andamans?
Well, I think they are just.
We've got these wonderful pictures of them here in canoes.
Yeah,
for example.
That's a nice that appears in the book, and there they are using their bows and arrows to catch fish, and there they are again. It's the same thing. They also hunt along the seashore, and the seashore. There's a lot of mangrove swamps along the seashore, and they hunt dugong and turtles, great big sea turtles, and large fish, and they use sort of harpoons for that.
What's the difference between
they use bows and arrows?
What's the difference between the lifestyle of the men in the tribe and the women in the tribe?
They have their separate roles. The men are the hunters and the fighters, and they build the canoes. And the owner of the canoe is the person who discovered the tree that is suitable for a canoe. They're the fighters, of course, with their bows and arrows. The women cook, and they do cook. They had not discovered fire, these people, but having acquired it, presumably from lightning strikes or something. It is there, it's part of their life, and if they move village, they take the fire with them. The women collect along the coast. They collect the crabs and the prawns and the seafood. They also collect the berries and the leaves and the roots of the things that they eat. They have a wonderfully balanced diet in total harmony with nature and the environment. So that's the men and the women. They have quite an elaborate social system, very peaceful, very healthy, with respect for age, a respect for marriage, taboo relations between married people and younger unmarried people, but no problem about sex involving unmarried people and people in their late teens and before marriage. A great deal of importance given to generosity, hard work. Laziness is really despised, and bear in mind that there's tension between these 12 tribes, or originally 12 tribes, all speaking different languages. It's an incredible setup. It really is, with a very complicated social system, but an interesting one, and very close relations with nature and the environment. I mean, one of the stories is of the 2004 tsunami that came. Now, these people, the islanders, all moved inland, those are living along the coast. There were no islanders killed, whereas there were hundreds of settlers who were killed at that time. And this suggests a relationship between the islanders and nature, which we don't even begin to understand.
The British found the Andamans useful, or thought they'd find them useful, I think, during Napoleon's time, and had a sniff there and then went away, and then came back in the 1830s and went away again. It was of no use. But it finally became useful to the British in 1858 after the Indian Rebellion. And we've said before, they built this horrific cellular jail like a wheel with spokes to carry away from India, hundreds of miles from mainland India, people, and sort of abandon them here in the Andamans. And this now became an important British outpost. Here we have a picture of Government House, where the governor of the Andamans would live, and very quickly, Jonathan has explains in the book, a British a colonial way of life was established with parties and cricket and dancing and all of that sort of lovely stuff. In a sense, the islanders were an irrelevance, but they were observed, and there are some wonderful pictures here. I'll show you some more in a minute by a photographer, an anthropological photographer who was busy in 1911. Here is a picture of islanders on the beach with, well, who knows, it may even be Jonathan's grandfather. But you'll see in this picture how very much smaller. The point is, these people are pygmies. And here is a British official with pygmy islanders on either side. And look at this image here, even more extraordinary, perhaps, just to show the scale. Jonathan's grandfather was Reginald Lewis, and we have a picture of him here with his wife, probably in the garden of his house. There's another picture here. And here he is also with two of his children, Mary on the left and John. And the photograph that was taken before of the islanders on the beach, that photographer also took pictures. Well, these would be your aunt and uncle, wouldn't they, Jonathan, the people in this picture?
Yes, that's Mary on the right and John, who became a Gurkha during the Second World War. Yeah.
And there they are, meeting. Yeah. So this is the point. So for some of the islanders, some of these 12 tribes, there was a degree of contact. Here again are the children, again with two Aboriginal children examining a turtle on the beach. And perhaps the most extraordinary image, this one of Mary being greeted by a whole crowd of adults there. And Jonathan, you can tell us what was happening in this picture. I think you know the background to it.
Yeah, the background is that was sent to me by the little boy shown in the photograph, my cousin Ian. And on the back of it was written the islanders who'd come to present his father's parents, i.e., our grandparents, with a pair of dugong tusks as a present for the hospitality that the islanders, had received from my grandparents. My grandparents had this extraordinary and close relationship, which my mother brought me up on, and she loved it. She's regarded these as very, very special people. Anyway, there's a man in the front and presumably his wife at the back come to hand over the presents. So that's an extraordinary story, and it was just somehow that sort of relationship did not exist. Nowadays, in retrospect, knowing how contact between us and, of course, the Indians as well brought about the collapse in the population. You could say that they might have known or should have known that they were killing off the tribes by their contact with them, but they don't seem to have been fully aware of that. It doesn't come across in the literature, either from Radcliffe Brown or from my grandfather. So and incidentally, modern people can say, well, whatever's gone wrong there was the fault of the British, but there was no question of any exploitation to the extent that it was possible. These people were left alone. The Jarawa, there was a number of expeditions to take revenge or prevent the people from attacking and killing prisoners and their guards. But there was no sort of continuing war. And as far as the way things are right now, it's fascinating to find during my visit with my daughter that the conservation of the tribes is taken very seriously by the so-called locally born society, some of the prominent islanders who see the Aboriginals as very special people to be looked after. They are not saying our ills, such as they are the fault of the British. Far from it. I only wish that the Indian government, which is looking after the North Sentinelese and giving some sort of lip service to looking after the Jarawa, nevertheless have sanctioned the settlement of so much of the islands, so that it's going to be pretty miraculous if these incredibly special people can be saved from extinction.
The ironic thing, and the sad thing, is, of course, that the very people who were most willing to engage with the British in the time that the British were in charge are the ones who are least likely to have survived, the ones most likely to have caught diseases that they had no immunity to.
Absolutely, yes.
Precisely the tribes that have survived were the most resistant to contact, the most hostile, in fact,
absolutely,
to our presence.
Yes.
One of the things that Jonathan's book points out very starkly, I think, and it's terribly important, is that very little work has been done on these people. And I'm going to put up a picture now of Alfred Radcliffe Brown. And Jonathan, perhaps you can just say what makes Jonathan Radcliffe Brown so important. He was born, I think, in the 1880s and died in the 1950s.
Well, I'm not an expert on his life, Stephen, but I understand that he became one of the most important, best-known anthropologists of his age. He went out to the Andamans, and it was his first real job on the spot. He was very thorough. He really investigated amongst, first of all, the Onge on Little Andaman, but there were problems about interpretation and the language, and it was very difficult. And also they were only semi-friendly then. So he moved to North Andaman and worked amongst the tribes of the so-called Great Andamanese. He was there but on the islands between 1906 and 1908. And then left, and somehow he had some link with Cape Town University. His book, which actually I've got here, I don't know if, anyway, there's a wealth of information in that. It's 500 pages of information on the tribes, and there has been no comprehensive study of the tribes people and the Andaman since then. And it really effectively astounds me that there are these anthropologists who seem to be more preoccupied with the idea that the place was once part of the Indian Empire, rather than taking an interest in these very, very, very special people. Anyway, that was Radcliffe Brown, a bit of a hero, I would say.
His work was done. I mean, his field study of the Andamanese Aboriginal people was done between 1906 and 1908.
That's right.
The first time that you sort of got involved, I mean, you had a grandfather who was there, a mother who was brought up there, a mother who told you wonderful stories about what life was like on the Andamans that you fell in love with, that made you want to go back. But you were at one point approached by someone called Claire Anderson. Here she is, from Leicester University. I think, was she your route into this? What were her concerns?
Really.
I think she's okay.
No, not really, Stephen. Both myself and my sister Veronica, who incidentally has also been to the Andamans, but that was about 10 years ago.
All right.
We were approached, I think it must be possibly 15 years ago, I'm not sure of the date, by her. She's an academic from Leicester University, and we passed on to her various papers, articles that my grandmother had written, photographs, that sort of thing, and we shared them with her. And her particular interest was the way the islanders had been exploited for their curiosity, with a great deal of ignorance and prejudice, and islanders had been taken off to the mainland of India and dressed up in clothes, exotic clothes. They virtually all of them died because they succumbed to various diseases. But anyway, Claire's particular interest was that particular era and the relationship between the islanders and outsiders, particularly the British in Imperial India.
Right. You're also in
that
touch.
Looks like,
this is
Hegelberg.
Erika Hegelberg.
Yeah.
And you're in touch with her. You've been in touch with her as well. She is an important anthropologist.
Well, she is the person who, in the early 90s, she is a world expert on DNA, and she discovered some hair, Andamanese hair, which in a Cambridge lab that had been placed there by Alfred Radcliffe Brown, and she discovered the link with Africa, which was this incredibly exciting thing, that here were these people in the Andaman Islands who'd been there for and the air was 60 to 100,000 years old, establishing that link. How on earth did they get there? She was particularly keen to get to the Andamans and go and get more hair particularly from the Onji on Little Andamans. And she went there and she teamed up with somebody called Lalji Singh, who was an Indian anthropologist. And he eventually got to Little Andaman, but she had 2 trips out there, and there was bureaucracy. She was faced with terrible bureaucracy. There was this sort of sensitivity that the Indians seemed to feel right from the outset, and she had awful difficulties. Anyway, I was in touch with her as the heroine who had discovered this Andamanese hair, and I contacted her. Her initial response was the conventional one, well, I don't really want an awful lot to do with you because of the link with the British Empire, which I really, frankly, could not understand. Later on, I think she became more convinced of my goodwill. When I gave a talk in Albert to people when I was launching my book there, I invited her, and she was touched that we'd invited her to come. But boy, oh boy, that was all 6 months ago, and I keep on trying to fix a meeting because she could tell me an awful lot. She knows the island. I've been to the island, and I spent just over a week there. So, I'm not an expert. I would love to get people like her, other anthropologists, really interested in this whole business of saving these tribes and recognizing their extraordinary provenance.
Jonathan, there's a third or fourth personality here, Professor Vanessa Hayes.
Vanessa Hayes. She's sounds a very interesting person. She's never been there, but when I got in touch with her, she's actually a South African, and she's worked amongst the Bushmen or San people, and if it's her, that's her with Bushmen in Botswana or Namibia.
Yeah, she's trying to light a fire. They're showing her how to light a fire.
Fascinating. Yeah. Well, of course, this whole link between Botswana and the Andamans is something that might be studied in the future. Heaven knows. But she sounds a very, very interesting person, and was very interested to hear from me. But I hope somewhere along the line I'll meet her in due course.
A rather important character in your story, there are 2 others I think we need to mention. One is Dr. Ratan Chandra Kar. What makes him so important to work that's been done on the Jarawa?
Well, he sounds a great fellow. He's written a book called The Jarawas of the Andamans, which I bought when I was in the Andamans with my daughter. And he's a doctor, and that's the one exception to the rules that Jarawa had about contact. They did permit a limited medical presence at a small sort of cottage hotel on the coast, and he was there. And and he learnt the language, and bit by bit, he gained the confidence of the people. And he's got some fascinating stories about his own contact with them, and also the contact that the islanders, had with the new settlers. I think he's a little bit pie in the sky, if he would forgive me for saying so, in thinking that somehow the settlers and the Jarawa will all from now on live happily ever after. And he's got a story about a Jarawa boy who got his foot caught and was and broke his leg, and was taken off to hospital and came back having been convinced of the goodwill of the hospital and of the settlers, but nevertheless decided he certainly did not want to have a so-called civilized life and return to his tribal life. But anyway, as far as I know, Dr. Carr is still on the islands, and if there is to be some sort of contact, hopefully limited and not dangerous for the Jarawa, he might be somebody who could take part in that in the future.
Can you say how different Triloknath Pandit, Tian Pandit, has been? Because he also is an important figure in the story of the people.
Well, Pandit sounds to have been a great chap. He's really very elderly now. Dennis Giles, who's the editor of the Andaman Chronicle,
local newspaper,
told me, I think in an email, that he tried to contact Pandit, but I've put out the odd feeler, but I think he's now well and truly retired to the Indian mainland. But he was an anthropologist. He is really the professional expert now. He started off with establishing the nearest thing to sort of friendly relationship from an outsider with the Jarawa. He got to know some Jarawa youths, and he would go into Jarawa territory, and they had great fun sort of feeling him all over as if he was some sort of a different species. Yeah. Anyway, then he landed on North Sentinel, and at first he used to communicate with the people so that they were all in the water. The North Sentinelese were very nervous about allowing these outsiders onto the shore. But anyway, I think now that he's retired, the Indian government has banned all contact between outsiders and North Sentinel, and there are sort of naval patrols keeping outsiders away.
Yes, North Sentinel is now off limits to everybody. Now, the story of the Andaman Islands is that it was overrun by the Japanese in the last 3 years of the war. And then, of course, with Indian independence, it became a protectorate of India. Here are some recent stamps recalling the handover. I think it's the handover of India. And here is the problem, because this is where we're really leading to now. Although the Indians adopted the position that it was essential to protect the Aboriginal people, the Jarawa and the other surviving tribes, nonetheless, in what was it, 1991, Jonathan, a road started which became something called the Andaman Trunk Road from north to south, all the way down the island. You can see it on the screen now, driving through the ancestral forests that had been the domain of the tribes people. And the opening up of the island in this way, clearly done because, in particular, Indians were starting to settle on the island and build plantations, banana plantations. Banana is not a native vegetable. I think it's a vegetable, not a fruit. To the
Nor coconuts, incidentally.
Coconuts, yes, indeed. So, and these are very, very beautiful islands. And now a lot of the islands in the archipelago which have beautiful white sand, are being developed as luxury resorts and so forth. The phenomenon, though, of the Andaman trunk road that drives through the forest is that it opened up the tourist trade. And very quickly, you started getting this. And this is the horror. These are convoys of traffic. They all set off from the capital, Port Blair, in the morning. They all have to go together. And they're under certain limitations, aren't they? They have to go together. They have to keep their windows up. They're not allowed to get out of their cars. If they go by bus, the bus is not allowed to stop. And yet, what do we see in a picture like this? There is a bus, and there are tribespeople on the other side of the road, and those tribespeople have come to depend on the visitors. What exactly now, what has tourism done to the Jarawa, Jonathan?
Well, I think it's what people would fear could be done to the Jarawa. I mean, there are women and children who run along the road beside the vehicles with their hands stretched out, saying in Hindustani, "Do, do, do," which means give, give, give. I'm afraid when my daughter and I were in the Andamans, we talked to some people on Ross Island who told us that actually the buses do stop, and they do exchange honey or maybe an arrow or something like that, or biscuits or razors or something modern, or a torch. So there is that contact coming up. I gather that the hierarchy, the mature people, particularly I think it's the area of Terror in South Andaman, are very anti this new contact with outsiders, which they see as very dangerous for their whole future. But anyway, it's taking place. People like Dennis Giles and other contacts of the local Born Society that I met in are anti this and would like to see the Andaman Trunk Road closed. But whether that is realistic to think of that happening, I really don't know. I suspect not. You know, there's big financial interests in the hotel trade, the transport trade, and you know, the whole prospect of tourism, prospects for the place being a even bigger tourist attraction, including, you know, for the whole world. It is a wonderfully unspoilt place. And I wish sort of organizations like the World Land Trust could take some interest in them. But anyway, that's another thought. Not to mention organizations like Flora and Fauna International and other conservation organizations.
Well, I think we need to bring the conversation to a close. But I think just as a final question, Jonathan, where would you like the Andamans to be? What would you like to have happened in the next 10 or 15 years? Because something is clearly going wrong now. There isn't sufficient protection. The tourist industry is getting through. The people are becoming dependent on gifts. They're becoming obese. There's alcoholism and there's prostitution. And really, these are people who are not going to survive much longer, just in the same way as lots of African tribes failed to survive. Where would you like this to move?
What I'd like is some of the big names in conservation and the big organizations to recognize that this is not just another tribe which is in danger, because there are other tribes which have had contact with the rest of the world for thousands of years. These are people unadulterated. I really do stress unadulterated by influences from the outside world. Those only started with Marco Polo and company, and they have had little, if any, real influence on them. And if the world could come together and some of these big names, wouldn't it be wonderful if David Attenborough could give his support to a project to involve anthropologists and people, and in a friendly way, in concert with the Indian government and with world governments, do the necessary to preserve what is left of these extraordinary tribes.
I'm going to hand over to you, Penelope.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. A host of questions must have come up. Now, because we are relatively few in number, I think it may be possible for us all to unmute ourselves and to ask our questions direct. If you want to ask a question, can those who would like to ask the question for themselves raise their hand using the more function, and where it says raise hand, and then I will call on them to speak so that I don't speak across them. But just to get kicked off, Dick Bateman has posted a question. He said, would the people shown in the photographs be from tribes who were decimated by disease? Were they not the Jarawa themselves?
Jonathan?
So some of them would certainly not have been Jarawa. I'm sure that's right. Well, I couldn't tell whether they were Jarawa or not Jarawa. There are no tourists, as far as I know, that goes to South Andaman or Little Andaman, where there are quite a lot of Onji left there, and they are living in a totally dependent way on the administration. So they're not leading the Aboriginal life, and they seem doomed to early extinction. I think many of the people that we've seen on the pictures today would be Jarawa, but I really wouldn't know whether they're Jarawa or remnants of great Andamanese tribes.
Dick, what we haven't covered so far is that Reginald Lewis, who was the deputy commissioner and Jonathan's grandfather, was responsible during his time for conducting the great census, the 10-yearly census in 1911 and 1921, and that involved a massive amount of work. And he would go around by boat. He had a yacht. He would go around from island to island, counting the number of individuals that he could find and trying to make some sort of estimate, as all censuses do, going back to the Romans, of what the economic activity and what the economic potential was of the islanders and the places that they lived. And there were some islands, I mean, most he would get access to, and these again would probably have been the islanders who were friendly enough and then didn't survive because they were friendly. But certainly there were islands that he could not get through to. And I think, Jonathan, were the North Sentinelese, did he ever make contact with them?
In 1911, they wanted to count try and count the North Sentinelese, but they found it was too dangerous to carry on. Mm-hmm. And in 1921, knowing the way they were, they didn't even try.
Yeah.
They had quite a bit of difficulty, I gather, with the Onji on Little Andaman and on Rutland Island, and they could only estimate the number of Jarawa in both censuses. But he did get around the islands, yes. You talked about economic development. I don't think that he was merely involved in counting them, but along the way, for instance, that picture with Mary, that was during the census. So he had contact geographically and with people across the islands, which gave him, some wonderful perspectives.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I have a question. As we saw that dreadful, well, for my way of thinking, the dreadful photograph, very threatening photograph of the great convoy of public maxi cabs or private mini cabs queuing up to pass through the traditional lands of the Jarawa people, and the inevitable contact that goes on. What is happening within the Jarawa people? Presumably, this is leading to internal fissures, splits between those who can see some advantage in, an easier lifestyle or swift rewards from tourist industry or people passing by, and those who maybe, shall we say, the more traditionally minded and would like to go back to the old ways, or at least preserve the old ways as long as possible.
Yes. Well, that's absolutely. There is a problem there. I think that it hasn't been quite so bad over the last few months because of COVID. I'm told by the editor of the Andaman Chronicle that they closed the Andaman Trunk Road because of COVID, which was wonderful news. But yes, these women and children along the Andaman Trunk Road, begging and stopping vehicles and having communication. And that, I understand, is very, very much it's not the way they behaved in the past. And I think there's a lot of conflict or tension being aroused between them and the elders, particularly the Terua people of the Jarawa. So that is a problem. I mean, I don't know. I have never laid my eyes on an Andamanese Aboriginal. I've not seen one, but I have seen some. A very moving episode was on by video. I saw a take of a couple of young Jarawa men. They weren't old men. They were just ordinary, maybe mid-20s, early 30s. And they were saying, really pleading and saying, all we want is to be left alone. That to this day, these people value their way of life more than anything. And they're pleading with the rest of the world to be left alone. Unfortunately, they're not being left alone. There's even talk of a railway across the Andamans. So I don't know. I'm very, very much on the side of those people, and I think the world needs to know a lot more about them.
I think we should just sort of add there, to put it the other way around, that although the Jarawa tribes people may come to buses or may approach the convoys down to the forests begging, they do so because they've learnt to do so. They do so because the most attractive thing to the tourists who come to the Andamans is to treat the Andamans as a sort of human zoo. And they know that the Andaman people love biscuits, for example, cheap biscuits, because they're sugary.
Yeah.
And so they load up with packets of biscuits and they take the bus out for the day, and they hope to and now when the bus comes, the tribes people hear it coming and they'll come out, and in exchange for a gift of biscuits, they'll turn somersaults and they'll allow themselves to have selfies taken with them, and they'll give up their jungle honey and their bows and arrows that they hunt with, because they hunt wild pig and so forth. Yeah. And those legally, the buses aren't supposed to stop, but they do stop because that's what the tourists are paying for. Yeah. And we are allowing that. And there are attempts to persuade, to encourage the Indian government to prevent all this. But like you say, there are huge financial interests here. This is a really good day out if you're on holiday in the Andamans.
Yeah, it is actually, I gather, the major tourist destination for Indian tourists, the Andaman Islands. I mean, I was just amazed when we got there. I was expecting a small little airport with a few tourists coming in. In fact, the place was heaving with hundreds of tourists coming in and leaving. They've been extending the runway at Port Blair recently, I understand. What the tribal elders, or indeed anybody, can do about some of the, I was going to say a few women and children begging along the road, I don't know. Mainly that's really up to the tribes, but it's a new thing, and I gather that it really disturbs the tribal elders mightily.
That's one side of the coin. I mean, that's where the tourists don't realize that they're doing damage. They want to have a good holiday. There are other people like this character, John Chow, who went out there. He was a Christian missionary, and Jesus had told him to go and convert them. And he went out there against all advice not to, and he ended up being, what happened to him? He was shot by arrows, wasn't he?
Yes, he managed to. He bribed some fishermen to take him across. It's about 30 or 40 miles from the mainland, so it's well away from the main, the larger islands. It's about 30 or 40 square miles, and they have this. Nobody knows how many of them that there are, but obviously they have, into their whole system of life, they have adapted to a degree of interbreeding, and they seem perfectly healthy, and they're certainly very fierce. But anyway, he landed and started singing hymns and things, and then they made an aggressive move, and he ran back and he escaped with his canoe, and then he came back, I think it was the next day, as if he hadn't had warning, and they shot him, and that was that. And I don't think they've ever recovered the body. It's just, that was the end of him.
I have a question, Jonathan, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but there's a wonderful historic photographs of the Jarawa and the other related peoples of the Andamans, and I wonder, did at that time, to the best of your knowledge, did the Jarawa know how to interpret a photograph? Because a photograph is, one-dimensional, whereas human beings are three-dimensional and have temperature and smell, and they're tangible in a sense that a photograph isn't. Even British children have to be taught how to recognize their own reflections in a mirror, or how to recognize themselves in a photograph. So what did the Jarawa make of these photographs? Did they feel that their spirits were being seized upon or misused?
I think that's a very, very good question. I think, though, the contact was so minimal, they might have seen the odd photograph shown them by T.N. Pandit, and maybe by the French journalists who were interviewing those people I was telling you about, the two young men. But they certainly wouldn't have had the chance to see photographs as a matter of routine, very, very seldom, if at all.
Thank you. And I have another question if no one else wants to jump in ahead of me. I'm being very greedy here, but what is the Jarawa's attitude towards personal property? Is all property held in common, or do you have personal property?
Again, a wonderful question. There is personal property, but the convention, the habit is that if you ask your neighbor to give you something that he's got that you want, he is obliged to hand it over. And you are obliged to return something to him of equal value. And that's one of the interesting ways that, I mean, the whole business of present giving is very, very much part of the culture. And these strange in-laws, that strange relationship, there's an awful lot of present giving, but not an awful lot of actual communication. It's a fascinating thing.
Can I chip in and say something here? Jonathan feels very strongly that these people, with their links straight back, 100,000 years back to Africa, are so important to us because they embody stuff that we've lost over the years. Jonathan, having been brought up in the Kashmiri region before partition, before independence and then before partition, had the most wonderful experience in childhood of life as a British boy, but in what he feels was a very, very well integrated life of white kids and Indian kids. Then went on to live in Africa, and I think at one point you were a district commissioner, Jonathan, in Africa, perhaps the last white district commissioner. You have experience, don't you, of what, I mean, you've seen in Africa what could happen to these people. You've got direct experience of people who were taken and put, I mean, were they put on reservations and then it all went wrong?
Yeah, well, I've had a fascinating career, and it was racism in South Africa that led me into the British Overseas Civil Service, and I was the last district commissioner in Zambia, and I carried on in that role for a year or so after independence, which came in October 1964. I worked amongst my last district was the Gwembe Valley, where I speak the language, along the Zambezi, down at a low altitude in the Zambezi Valley, which is flooded by Lake Kariba. And just before I arrived, the lake had filled up, and the population had been on both sides of the river into what is now Zimbabwe and Zambia. People had moved inland. I'm just trying to think. Oh yes, you were asking about change.
What happened to the people there who the governments had wanted to protect, but in fact the plans
they were, these particular people. They were very keen on colonialism because they had protection from the fearsome Ndebele or the fearsome Lozi neighboring tribes, but they were, because of their isolation, they were in a way the women went topless. They had a sort of stick through their nose. They knocked out their front teeth, which probably has the origins of putting off slavers who came up the Zambezi to grab hold of them. They were very pro-government, and I think they were very pleased that there was a British district commissioner still with them for a bit after independence. But even the Tonga and the other tribes I came across in that part of Africa, they did not resist change. They went along with change. They went along with employment on the Copperbelt. They went along with cultivation. They had this contact with other tribes, with other people, for perhaps for thousands of years. Not like the Andamanese, who had no contact at all. So anyway, of a different setup, but in the Zambezi Valley, not that far from Botswana. I mean, I know Botswana. I've seen the Bushmen there, and there were interestingly in the Zambezi Valley there were stories. I think I mentioned one of them in the book, of these little people who you came across if walking around in the hills of the Zambezi escarpment, and you'd see this chap coming towards you, and they were quite friendly, the little people, and you greet him, and he would say, "When did you see me?" And you said, "Oh, I saw you coming from a long way away," and he would be joyful, and he'd perhaps do a little dance. But if you say, "I've just seen you," he got into a terrible rage because he was terribly conscious about his height. Now, I mention that because these were traditional tales amongst the Tonga, and they'd obviously had way back in the distant past, there were stories of these little people, possibly these Bushmen and others and the San, coming through their area, off on their migrations across the world, thousands of years ago. I don't know, it's just speculation. It's a nice thought.
I'm fascinated, Jonathan, by what you said about the 2004 tsunami had not resulted in significant loss of the Jarawa people, that they seem to have sensed or interpreted the geographical signs that trouble was on the way, and they had made for higher ground inland. Has any attempt been made to understand what it was that they were sensing and reacted to?
As far as I know, absolutely none. And it's just an example, probably one of hundreds, of what makes these people different, they are human beings. And they have a wonderful system, but they have not had the influence of other cultures on them, and that's what makes them really, really special. And I wish we knew how to get the answer to that sort of question.
How, in your experience and given your study of the subject, how can we authentically help the Jarawa to determine their own futures? Because if we leave them exclusively alone, it's a little bit like putting them in a game reserve, which is a horrible characterization, but it's an artificial reserve. But if we allow them to be prostituting themselves and stopping tourist buses and losing their own culture, they will disappear as a people. So how do we actually make the contact and understand them using their own eyes, their own values, to determine their own futures?
I think you've hit on a really important point, and I really don't know the answer to that. In a sense, they being left alone and the way things were structured, they were taking their own decisions. They were sovereign. They were not being influenced by anybody else. And I think the British did actually sense this, and they didn't try and interfere with their life. And to a certain extent, that's the policy of the Indian government as well. As regards the future, I don't think that can change. I think that their way of life is their way of life, and I don't think they can be brought into some sort of representative government or something like that. They've just got to be kept apart. And incidentally, it just strikes me that a friend of mine who read my book said, maybe the only real answer to the future of these people is that even the anthropologists everybody should be just kept away in the interests of these future, because of your book, or having gained the involvement of anthropologists and others, people suddenly start taking a greater interest. There is going to be this pressure to get involved with them, to consult with them, to gain some of their wisdom, and that could be the last thing that they need. That could lead to their demise, very sadly.
Penny, at the end of Jonathan's book, we've put in a note about Survival International, and Survival International is a charity caring for tribes and indigenous peoples, and one of those here is the Jarawa in India. Do you see? And if you click on that, it brings you to a page here which talks immediately about human safaris, and how, although the Supreme Court in 2002 in India ordered that the highway, the Andaman Trunk Road, be closed, it remains open, and it remains a route to this human safari park. And in addition, that poachers enter the forest and steal the animals, and they've introduced alcohol and marijuana and sexually abuse the Jarawa women. And here, if you click here, it tells you how we should act and how we can donate. Now, we're not, unfortunately, we've tried to solicit the help of Survival International, because rather, as Jonathan was saying before, with Vanessa Hayes and Erica Hailberg, there is a lot of self-protection in the academic community, and there's a lot of self-protection in the political community, and this Survival International is rather political, and they don't like sharing their territory. And it's a great pity, and Jonathan is constantly frustrated. It isn't. We all have the same mission here. It's to save these people, and we should all be working together. And yet the academics are doing one thing, and these political activists are doing something else, and Jonathan's doing something else, and there are gulfs between them, and they will not come together. And it's a tragedy, and it's a tragedy for the Jarawa.
Yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned.
Absolutely agree with that entirely.
I'm glad you mentioned Survival International, because using old style technology, I just had it at the top of a notepad and jotted down Survival International and Flora and Fauna International, because I know that one of the former directors of Kew Gardens was very keen on the survival of indigenous people, because he said you cannot separate the indigenous people from the survival of the world's flora and fauna, because they interact and cultivate and use and understand plants in ways that we in the so-called northern world no longer really have that instinct or intimacy with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that an aspect of this is that Robin Hanbury-Tennyson, who is the president of Survival International, has been fantastically enthusiastic about Jonathan's book. I mean, has written effusively about it, and has tried to bring Jonathan to his board at Survival International, and he hasn't managed to sell the idea of working together. It's a terrible pity.
Very sad.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, he was very understanding, and we had some good conversations, and he's cooperated in links with Dennis Giles in the Andamans. I feel that somehow one could unlock a relationship there, and the case of the Andamans and the Jarawa could be something that would help Survival International in their general quest at saving other endangered tribes. But somehow they somehow have not really recognize that the Jarawa and the Andamanese are very special and different.
Mm.
I think another feature that's very interesting about the Jarawa is they have seemed up until the present to be very uninterested in change. You know, change is practically a religion in the Western world, and development is considered to be unimpeachable good, and yet the Jarawa don't seem to want to accumulate, don't seem to want to change, and don't seem to want to develop very much. I mean, there are elements now, obviously, with their increasing contact with other cultures, but nevertheless, historically, apart from perhaps appreciating little pieces of metal that they could tip their their arrows with and their spears with, they don't seem to have really been very interested in change.
Penny, that's the essence of it. They hate change. They fear change. Their instinct have told them that change means the end of them. So, you know, that is the Jarawa. And I fear if we expected them to change, you know, we were expecting too much. And I think maybe Dr. Carr thinks that it is possible by some sort of implication, but from all that I've read and heard, I don't think that's a possibility. And I don't think that we in the outside world who care about their future should be trying to press them into any sort of change. It means that they're different from the rest of humanity. I mean, my PhD was all about bringing change to the people who felt that leadership was not something that Africans did until independence came. But there were so few African leaders and managers for instance, in the mining industry. And to get people to understand what leadership is about and learn from other cultures, that in a sense has been my speciality. But it does not apply to the Andamanese. That's in a way what makes them so interesting.
And it's also what makes them so vulnerable, and what makes this whole problem so, what's the word, paradoxical. One wants to know about them more. Penny, you've been asking such good questions about them, and the answer is we don't know, and studies haven't been done. And Jonathan and I were talking in the afternoon, and he was saying how urgently we need a major academic study so we can understand them better. And yet at the same time, there is the irony that, you know, the problem of the experiment, the damage that can be done by interacting with the very thing that you want to stand back from and look at dispassionately. How do we look at the Jarawa? How do we understand their life? How do we study them anthropologically without being there on the site, watching them closely, and then becoming a toxic element in the very life that we want to keep separate from us? It's a real problem. I mean, we could put up cameras in the forest, I suppose, and stuff like that. But maybe that's the reason. Maybe there's a huge sensitivity in academic circles about getting too close. I suspect there isn't, because it's clear that people like Vanessa Hayes have got very close to tribal people. But there is a massive shortage of information.
Sorry, Stephen, to break in, but I wonder if Lou has got any question. She's been very patient.
No, well, I've been listening very carefully. I suppose my thoughts are, I mean, I have to say, I didn't know anything about, other than the name, I think, of the Andaman Islands. So this is all very new information for me. And it is a paradox. And I think that's what I'm left with, about how do we not continue, as we have done all over the world, to exploit and asset strip knowledge and far more from people. How do we act in a very different way, and if there is time to do so?
There's a postcard which shows, you know, the tourist experience in the Andamans, and there in the top left-hand corner, look, one of the jolly things that you can see when you're in the Andamans is native islanders. doing a dance. It is really dreadful.
A question for Jonathan. Is there a king of the Jarawa? What's their hierarchy like?
Another very good question. There isn't really a hierarchy. In the different communities, the people who have it's influence rather than authority, and the influence is really all that you need to bring to bear if there's some sort of dispute or there's been effectively a crime or something. And that influence is exercised by older people. And the part of the culture is the importance given to age. And that is really perhaps the most important aspect of their culture. There isn't such a thing as a paramount chief of the Andamans, of the Jarawa or any other tribe.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions that anybody would like to ask before we wrap up this evening's proceedings?
It seems to me that we'd have a lot to learn from the Jarawa people, but how we can do that without respectfully, I don't know.
Could I ask you, Penny, something? Is there any way we could get this broadcast across to be seen and heard by David Attenborough? Because I see him as just about the only person with the weight and the authority, if he would take an interest. I've written to him about 3 or 4 times, and he is very courteously, I have met him through Fauna and Flora International, which I'm a member of, but he says, look, I get asked by all sorts of people. I do not know the Andamans, and therefore I'm sorry, I've got to turn you down. And that's as I say, I've written 3 times to him.
Well, I'm certainly willing to give it a go, and if I can obtain an electronic communication with him, I certainly could forward the recording. But whether or not Mr. Attenborough is in a position to respond is another matter. At this stage, I would have thought that Flora and Fauna International would have been a possible NGO that would take an interest, and possibly Kew also, Kew Gardens, Royal Gardens in Kew, because of their seed bank and because of the unique knowledge that people such as the Jarawa have of their plants and natural ecology.
What you've just said is encouraging when you mentioned Flora and Fauna International, because it so happened that I was the first director of the Royal African Society. This is quite some years ago. And I managed to get Mark Rose, who was the chief executive of Flora and Fauna, and I had met him, and we know each other a bit. And I managed to get him appointed to the council of the Royal African Society. It seemed appropriate, because conservation and wildlife and nature is very important to Africa. So any way of getting something to him and perhaps jog him again, and in the nicest possible way, perhaps seek his understanding and his support, that would be lovely. Or maybe through him to David Attenborough. That wonderful.
It's very strange.
Hugely happy.
It's very strange because, I mean, you're in Bath, and just down the road, as it were, is BBC Bristol. And I have tried time and time again to get into, BBC Bristol is the home of natural history. And I feel I haven't managed to break through that, human beings are also part of the natural world as well. And I talk to producers there and they say, oh yes, it's very important. I said, why not make a program about this? Because it's just as important as habitat loss, and it's just as important as, extinction of the leopard and macaques and stuff like that. And I've just got nowhere. If anyone has a route into BBC Bristol, because it seems to me that this is it's like the elephant in the room, this subject. It's calling out for attention. It's calling out for a big, as Jonathan says, big Attenborough 6-part special, and it's not happening, and I can't get why.
We can bring it to the attention of the Royal Geographical Society. Their ethos has changed from being intrepid white explorers going off to far parts of the world. They're now trying to engender exploration by people in their local environments. There may be a way of the Royal Geographical Society taking up something like this. I'm not quite sure how. We at BRLSI have a very close link with the local branch of the chairman of which is Jeff Parks, and he, Penny and I know him well. So I can submit this sort of from the grassroots up to the hierarchy, who are relatively receptive to their local branches.
Yeah. Well, that would be fantastic if you could, and put them in touch with us.
Absolutely.
That would be staggeringly good.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Well, shall we leave it on that possibly optimistic note that each of us who have learnt so much tonight from the conversation between Stephen Games and Jonathan Lawley, and had these wonderful insights into the rarities of Jarawa life and fabulous historic photographs, and a great deal to think about our disappearing world. Perhaps we can all do something about it, think of the links we've got, and thank Jonathan and Stephen very much indeed for bringing this to our attention, for making it so lively, to lavish illustrations with really rare photographs, and giving up your time when you must be very busy on other projects, and to thank our audience and to wish you all a very good night. Thank you very much indeed. We can show our appreciation by clapping if you feel you'd like to do so. I certainly will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you thank you to all of you. Really great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. Well done.
Thank you and good night. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.